The Value of Compassion. The Story of Florence Nightingale. Once upon a time, in far-off Italy, a young couple were admiring their brand-new baby daughter. "Isn't she lovely?" Mrs. Nightingale said. "Well, what should we name her?" It occurred to me, why not call her Florence? Florence was the name of the city in Italy where the little girl was born. "A splendid idea," cried her husband. "Yes, Florence Nightingale sounds just right for her." One evening, when Florence was almost a year old, her sister, Parthenope, was 2. Mrs. Nightingale spoke thoughtfully to her husband. "I think we should go back to England," she said. By now the Nightingales had been living in Italy for 3 years. "Aren't you happy here?" asked Mr. Nightingale. "Yes, of course," replied his wife. "It's been wonderful. But the girls are growing so fast. We must think of them and their future." "You're right," agreed Mr. Nightingale. "It's time we enriched ourselves in our own country." And so the Nightingales packed up all their trunks and returned to the country estate in Derbyshire, England. It was called Lea Hurst, and Miss Nightingale and Mr. Nightingale had a fine new house built there for his family. "It's delightful!" exclaimed Mrs. Nightingale when she saw it. "And such a wonderful view! I shall be able to invite all my friends to visit and have marvelous parties." Miss Nightingale loved to have lots of people around. As Florence and Parthenope were growing up, the house was always full of friends and relatives. They enjoyed the company, and Florence was especially happy when there were small children among the visitors. "Do let me take care of the little ones," she would beg. Then she would spend all her time looking after them, inventing games to amuse them, and making sure they didn't hurt themselves. Among the children brought to visit the Nightingales, Florence had a particular favorite, a little cousin named Robert. "Poor wee thing," said Florence to her sister as she bounced Robert on her knee. "Hardly anyone pays attention to him, except maybe to say what an ugly baby he is." "Well," observed Parthenope, "it's true, isn't it?" "But there's no need to love him less," said Florence. You see, Florence was a very compassionate little girl. She could never see misfortune without feeling great pity and wanting desperately to do something about it. It was the same with animals. If Florence heard that a horse was injured or a calf was sickly, she haunted the stable or barn, doing whatever she could to help. And she was forever rescuing orphaned squirrels or wounded birds and caring for them until they could manage on their own. "I declare," said Mr. Nightingale one day when he came home upon Florence and one of her special patients, "I think you worry more about that sparrow than you do about your family." "But, Father," Florence pointed out, "there's no need for me to worry about any of you. You're all strong and healthy." "Yes, of course," laughed her father. "Just don't let your compassionate heart make you neglect your lessons." Mr. Nightingale himself looked after his daughter's education. He taught them Latin, Greek, French, Italian, history, philosophy, and mathematics. Florence was a keen student, but Parthenope did not much enjoy the lessons. "I don't really see why we need to know all this," she grumbled. "I'd much rather be helping Mother arrange the flowers for the party tonight." Florence simply couldn't understand it. She found arranging flowers very boring. When the girls were not busy studying, they often accompanied their mother on her weekly visit to the cottages around Lea Hurst. Many poor people lived in those cottages, and Mrs. Nightingale took them food and other necessities. "It's our duty to help those less fortunate than ourselves," she would tell her daughters. Florence did not need to be told. Her compassionate young heart ached to see the misery in which some of the cottagers lived. "It just isn't fair that these people are so poor," she cried. "I know," replied her mother, "but we do what we can for them, and we can't change the world." But Florence felt like she could be doing more for the cottagers. As she grew older, she began visiting them on her own, especially those who were sick. She would tidy their rooms, rub their backs, make them tea or broth, and then sit quietly and talk to them for a while. "Where's Florence?" asked Mr. Nightingale as he sat down to dinner one evening when Florence was 16. Before anyone could answer, Florence herself came flying into the dining room. "I'm sorry I'm late. Old Granny Clarkson is very ill, and she likes to have me sit with her." "That's the third time this week," Florence scolded her mother. Compassion is all very well, but it can be carried too far. You have other obligations. I know I do, but it seems a little to do if it comforts her. Well, make sure you're on time tomorrow. We're having guests. Oh, not again, thought Florence. For some time now, she had been finding her mother's parties more and more pointless and tiresome. Do stop moping, Florence, and come and greet our guest, urged Mrs. Nightingale, as the final carriage pulled up to the door. What's wrong with you, anyway? It just all seems like such a waste of time, murmured her daughter. Nonsense, replied Mrs. Nightingale. With all these nice young men who think the world of you, what more could a girl your age want? Now you stop being so critical and try to enjoy yourself like the other young people. Come on, Florence, said Parthenope. The music and dancing will be so much fun, and the boys are so handsome. Florence sighed. There has to be more to life than all these silly parties, she said to herself. But being a polite and considerate person, she went and greeted the guests with a smile. Dear me, thank goodness that's over, thought Florence, as she struggled into bed. I'm not sure I can take many more evenings like that. Oh, stop feeling sorry for yourself, Florence Nightingale, called a little voice. Florence sat bolt upright. Who's there? She cried. Just me, answered the voice. Florence looked around. The voice seemed to come from the lamp beside her bed. But lamps don't speak, she quavered. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, replied the lamp. How can you be so sure? Who are you? Demanded Florence. A friend. You can call me what you like. Florence thought for a moment. I know. I shall call you Lucy. It means light, so it's a perfect name for a lamp. But what are you doing here, Lucy? Well, you don't seem to be very happy with your life, and I thought you could use someone to talk to. Now Florence was sure that lamps don't speak, but she realized that she was imagining Lucy because she did indeed need someone to talk to. You're right, she admitted. I usually am, said Lucy airily. Now then, what were you going to do about your life? It's just the trouble, wailed Florence. I don't know what to do. I feel so useless. You help your mother, don't you? Suggested Lucy. I sort and count linens and china and silver, if that's what you mean. It just makes things worse. How can reasonable people want all that stuff when so many others live in such misery? I see your point, agreed Lucy. But do you see what I can do about it? There's something you'll have to decide for yourself. You're a very compassionate person, but you're still quite young. My advice is to keep looking around you to see what needs to be done. In time, you'll think of ways to help people. I do hope you're right, sighed Florence. Twice every year, the Nightingale spent several weeks in London. These times were particularly difficult for Florence. She was not allowed to wander around alone the way she could at Lea Hurst, and so there seemed to be no way for her to do anything for those in need of help. Do you see those children, Parthenope, as we drove into town? She said to her sister. They looked so sickly and hungry and cold. Do you see the filth and garbage in their street, running down into the river like that? People get their drinking water from it. Of course I saw, Florence, but what point is there in thinking about such unpleasant things? I can't help it, cried Florence. These people are so different from us, These people are no different from us, except that they have no money. They shouldn't have to live in such conditions. I agree, replied Parthenope, but there really isn't much we can do for them. Nonsense, said the little voice sternly. I hope I never hear you talk like that, Florence. There's a lot a person with compassion and determination can do. Oh, Lucy, whispered Florence, I'm so glad you're here. She glanced anxiously at Parthenope, wondering what her older sister might make of a talking lamp. Florence was the only one who could see and hear her little friend. The day seemed an endless string of parties and gossipy visits and preparations for more parties. Florence became very depressed. Oh, do snap out of your bad mood, said her mother impatiently. All you do is sit there and mope. Why can't you be more like your sister and enjoy the nice young people around you? But Florence had no interest in the social world. She tried to explain to her mother that she needed to be doing something more worthwhile, but it did no good. What am I going to do, Lucy? Florence whispered wearily to her friend. Don't get too downhearted, answered Lucy. You will know when the time comes. "I'm worried about Florence," said Mrs. Nightingale to her husband, as their stay in London neared its end. "She seems to have no interest in anything." "I don't think that's completely true," replied Florence's father. "She's a good student, and she enjoys learning." "Yes, but a girl her age should be wanting to have fun, too. Why don't we take her on a trip? We could go back to Italy. Maybe that will help change her ideas." Mr. Nightingale thought for a while. "That's a very good suggestion." And so the Nightingales set out for Italy. They crossed France in a large coach, and Mr. Nightingale had designed himself. It had 6 attendants, and the coach was drawn by 3 pairs of horses. Florence kept careful notes on all the places they passed through, notes about distance and the weather and the laws and the conditions in which people lived. She also enjoyed herself enormously. She loved the beautiful cathedrals and the squares and the palaces they saw and the wonderful concerts they heard. Best of all, she loved the city of Florence, where they went to splendid balls and met very many interesting people. Eventually, it was time to go back to England. Mrs. Nightingale was delighted with the way that her idea had turned out. At last, Florence seemed to be behaving like other girls her age. But Florence had not really forgotten her concern for the poor and helpless of the world. As soon as she got back to Lea Hurst, Florence started visiting the sick people in the village again. In the evening, she would sit and talk quietly to Lucy about their problems. "I can give them compassion, Lucy, and maybe make them a bit more comfortable. But that's not enough. I don't know what to do to make them well. If only I knew more." "Can't you learn?" asked Lucy. And suddenly it came to Florence. She knew what she wanted to do. "That's it, Lucy," she exclaimed. "I will learn. I will learn everything I can about hospitals and about diseases and injuries and how to treat each one. I'm going to become a nurse." "Oh dear," said Lucy. "What on earth will your family say?" Florence's family was shocked. At that time, nursing was not a respected profession. "A daughter of mine doing nursing? Never!" cried her horrified mother. "Florence, you just can't be a nurse," shrieked her sister. "What would people say?" "Girls of your background don't do nursing," added her father more gently. "The conditions are appalling. You would not be able to stand it." Mrs. Nightingale and Parthenope became quite upset at the thought of it all. Arguments followed arguments. Months passed, and years. But Florence was determined. She bought books on medicine and studied them in her room at night. She had her friends on the continent send her reports on hospitals and institutions for the poor in other countries. "What is all that for?" asked Lucy, eyeing the mountain of papers surrounding Florence. "Well, I have to know what's going on before I can do anything about it," Florence explained. "Can't argue with that," said her friend. One day, Florence even persuaded a doctor friend of hers to show her around a London hospital. She was horrified at what she saw. The conditions were dreadful. The patients were dirty and uncared for. The wards and beds were filthy, with rats running across the floor. There was not enough doctors to take care of everyone. The nurses and attendants were almost as dirty as the patients. I can understand why your parents are so set against you nursing," said Lucy. "I'm going to change all this," vowed Florence. She was more determined than ever to fulfill her dream of becoming a nurse and making nursing a respectable job. Florence knew she still had much, much more to learn about nursing. "I believe they're making great improvements in hospitals in other countries," said Lucy one day. "Why don't you accept some of those invitations from friends who want you to visit them abroad? You might be able to visit some hospitals while you're at it and study how they are run." "Lucy, what a splendid idea!" cried Florence. "And if I just don't mention hospitals to Mother, she won't even worry about me." Indeed, Mrs. Nightingale, remembering how well the earlier trip had worked to distract Florence, was quite happy to see her daughter off on a new round of visits. Florence traveled around France and Germany and Ireland. Everywhere she went, she visited hospitals and learned everything she could about them. She took notes on how they were organized and furnished, and how the patients were treated, and how they were fed. By the time Florence returned home, she was an expert on hospitals and how they should be run. Florence's parents were still very opposed to her nursing in a hospital in London. However, in those days, when well-to-do people were sick, they were cared for in their own homes. Only the poor went to hospitals. Mrs. Nightingale could not bear the idea of her daughter working among such people. "I absolutely refuse," she said flatly every time Florence returned to the subject. "A girl of your upbringing does not do that sort of thing." Anyway, your aunt is ill, she added. Since you are so keen to nursing, I suggest you go and nurse her. Florence did not like upsetting her parents, so she went to nurse her aunt. I'm certainly happy to do what I can for Aunt, she confided to Lucy, but I feel there are people out there who need me far more. Her little friend understood how Florence felt. Give it some time, she said. Maybe your parents will change their minds. Lucy knew this was unlikely, but she wanted to keep Florence's spirits up. Then, a short time later, something happened that allowed Florence to take things into her own hands. Can you guess what it was? Florence was offered a job. She was asked to take over as superintendent of a small London hospital. It was a special hospital for sick women of good background who had no families to care for them. Florence's task would be to completely reorganize it in new quarters. There will be a great deal to do, Lucy, said Florence. I know, replied Lucy, but you'll love doing it. Once again, Lucy was right. Florence threw herself into the job. She organized beds, carpets, curtains, pots, and pans. The most important thing is that the hospital be clean and comfortable for the patients and that they feel loved and cared for, said Florence. Her biggest problem was finding good nurses. There did not seem to be any who were properly trained, so Florence undertook to train them herself. She set strict rules and sent away anyone who would not follow them. At the same time, she showed the same compassion for her nurses as she did for her patients. She listened to their problems and saw to it that they were all well and fairly treated. They responded by doing their work well and cheerfully. Soon Florence had the best-run hospital in England. People began coming to study her methods of nursing, sanitation, and hospital organization. Oh, Lucy, said Florence joyfully. At last, I'm doing what I want. About a year after Florence started nursing in London, Britain became involved in a war against Russia. Turkey, Britain, and France wanted to stop Russia from taking some land belonging to Turkey. This land was called Crimea. The British fought some terrible battles there against the Russians. Many men were killed, and many more were wounded. Soon the London newspapers were full of stories about the terrible conditions wounded and sick soldiers in the Crimea were suffering. The public began to demand that something be done to get proper care for these brave men. Reports from the battlefront are dreadful, Florence, said Mr. Sidney Herbert. Men are dying by the hundreds from lack of proper food, clothing, and medical care. Mr. Herbert was Secretary of War and one of Florence's oldest friends. Something has to be done, he added, showing her sketches that had been made of hospital conditions. Florence was horrified when she saw them. I know I'm asking a lot, Florence, but I want you to get together a group of nurses and go out to Crimea and organize proper care for the sick and the wounded. Needless to say, Florence agreed to go. Florence knew this was not going to be easy, but she welcomed the challenge. Come on, Lucy, we have a lot to do, and the sooner we're on our way, the better. Florence immediately set about organizing what they needed for the journey. Our biggest task is finding competent and compassionate nurses to come with us. There aren't too many of those around, remarked Lucy. Eventually, Florence managed to recruit 38 nurses, some of them nuns. Together, they set out for the long journey to Crimea. At last, Florence and the nurses arrived in the British hospital in Scutari. They were shocked at what they saw. Oh, ma'am, look at what they call a hospital, cried one of the nurses. They don't even have proper wards. The men are just lying in the corridors. They were long, windy, old corridors with rats running everywhere. There were no running water and no heat. Rain leaked through the roof. The Crimea, where the actual war was taking place, was across the Black Sea from Scutari. The conditions under which the British soldiers were fighting there could hardly have been worse. There were very few supplies. When winter came, it was bitterly cold. The men did not have enough blankets or food. They were fighting without coats or boots in freezing weather. They were dying from exhaustion. Those who survived were very weak. The wounded arriving by the hundreds at Scutari had been further weakened by the rough boat trip across the Black Sea. When they were left at the hospital, there was nowhere to put them except on the floor. There was not enough doctors to take care of them all, and many died before anybody got to attending them. The doctors and officials did not trust Florence and would not listen to her. They did not like the idea of women in army hospitals, and they refused to let Florence or her nurses help with the wounded. "What are we going to do, Miss Nightingale?" asked one of the nurses. "We can't just stand around and watch these poor men suffer." "Nor will we," replied Florence firmly. "For the moment, there's nothing we can do about the men's wounds, but there's certainly something we can do about this place. Come on, ladies, let's get to work." And work they did. They scrubbed floors, they collected straw and made beds for the sick and wounded, they rolled bandages and made splints, and set up their own kitchen where they prepared the kind of food sick men could digest. Still the doctors refused to let Florence nurses tend the wounded, except one day 500 unexpected casualties arrived at once. "You must let us help with these men," Florence urged the doctors. Reluctantly they agreed, and they quickly realized that Florence knew what she was doing. They came to rely more and more on her, and soon she was organizing the whole place. She made changes in the kitchens, organized for better sanitation and more efficient distribution of supplies. But above all, Florence saw to it that the men were properly looked after. They were washed and given clean clothes, and their injuries were taken care of. Every night, Florence would walk through the wards with her lamp. "Come over and talk with me," one soldier after another would cry as she passed by. Florence had a word for all of them. For the first time, the soldiers felt taken care of. They looked forward to seeing her quietly checking out her patients. They called her the Lady with the Lamp. Several times newspaper reporters stopped at Scutari on their way to or from the Crimean front. One was a very famous journalist called William Howard Russell from the London Times. "Conditions are not good, Miss Nightingale," he said. "I know," replied Florence, "but my nurses and I are doing the best we can." "You seem to be the only ones who are. The other hospitals I have seen are far, far worse." William Howard Russell reported back to London on the dreadful conditions in the army hospitals. He also told how Florence Nightingale was the only one doing something about it. As a result of his stories, Florence was soon famous throughout England. "Lucy," Florence said to her friend one day, "I keep hearing about hospitals where conditions are even worse than here. I think I should travel around to see them. There may be something I can do." Lucy agreed. "Your nurses are so well trained they can look after things here for a while." So Florence crossed the sea to Crimea. The conditions in hospitals were indeed very bad. She gave advice on how things could be improved, but before she could see the work through, something very sad happened. Suddenly, Florence felt dangerously ill. "I don't think she's going to live," said one doctor. "We just can't let her die," replied another. "What are we going to do without her?" When the men in the hospital heard of Florence's illness, they were very upset. They had come to love this beautiful, compassionate lady. As the news spread, Britain's soldiers everywhere prayed for her recovery. "Come on, Florence," whispered Lucy. "You must get well. So many people need you." But poor Florence was so sick she could hardly hear her friend. For many days, Florence hovered on the edge of death. But her will to live was very strong. Finally, the fever broke, and slowly she began to recover. Everybody was very happy when she was well again. As soon as she was strong enough, Florence was back at work. She supervised the hospital and did her rounds, making sure that the soldiers were as comfortable as possible. She had her nurses write letters home for them and provided books and newspapers to help distract them. She made sure that their uniforms and nightshirts were clean and that their wounds were properly taken care of. Before the war was over, many men owed their lives to Florence's care and compassion. Finally, the war came to an end, but Florence's work was not finished. On the boat back to England, she took care of the wounded. "Florence, you must get some rest," said Lucy, alarmed at how thin and pale Florence was. "Once I get home, I will rest," replied Florence. "These men still need to be cared for." Many people in England wanted to give Florence a hero's welcome, but she would not hear of it. "All I want to do is get home to Lea Hurst and my family," she told Lucy. When Florence arrived at Lea Hurst, her parents were shocked at the change in her. "You're so thin," cried her mother. "You look so weak and tired." "I'll sit in the sunshine and rest," said Florence. After a few days, Florence felt much better. Soon she was fretting to get back to her work. There was still so much more to be done. Artists had painted many pictures of Florence, making her rounds with her lamp, and sculptors had made statues of her. When she returned to London, she was amazed to discover that people recognized her wherever she went. "Miss Nightingale, this is my little daughter," women would say. "I named her after you." Everybody was talking about the wonderfully compassionate lady who had taken care of their soldiers in the war. Another surprise was waiting for Florence. A fund had been set up in her honor. Many of the soldiers she had nursed contributed to it. This fund eventually amounted to a great deal of money. Florence was ecstatic. "Now I can open a real school of nursing, Lucy," she said. "A school where young girls can be taught about sanitation and trained in proper nursing methods." She decided to set up the Nightingale Training School at St. Thomas's Hospital in London. St. Thomas's is still one of the most famous nursing schools in England today. Queen Victoria of England had heard so much about Florence that she wanted to meet her. "Miss Nightingale, it's an honor to meet such a compassionate person," said the Queen. "You have done wonderful work." "Thank you, Your Majesty," replied Florence. "But there is so much more we need to do. I am sure you agree that the health of your army is very important." Queen Victoria did indeed agree. "Yet even in peacetime," Florence continued, "the death rate among soldiers is higher than the general population. That must change." "I will help you in any way I can," promised the Queen. Florence worked very hard. She collected mountains of information on the conditions in which soldiers lived. She wrote hundreds of letters and spent hours and hours talking to officials. "Oh, Lucy, sometimes I get so tired," she said. "I can hardly stand up." "I'm afraid your illness in the Crimea has had a lasting effect on your health," said her friend. Sadly, Lucy was right again. Soon Florence had to spend most of her time lying down. But this did not stop her. She simply did her work from her bed. After many years of hard work, Florence saw great results. Army barracks were less crowded, better ventilated, and provided with reading rooms, and the men were better fed, and the health of the soldiers improved. In India, where the death rate among British soldiers was particularly high, Florence suggested improvements in sanitation. Soon the death rate dropped. It was now considered respectable for young girls to do nursing. Hospitals became clean and cheerful places, and people got better more quickly. Many nurses trained in the Nightingale method went abroad and worked in hospitals. They were always very welcome because of their superior nursing skills and compassion. Even though Florence was an invalid for many years, she always kept in touch with her nurses. Florence was 90 when she died. The whole world mourned this extraordinary, compassionate woman. Through her caring and compassion, Florence Nightingale changed a great many lives. Ordinary soldiers were treated decently and lived longer, healthier lives. Hospitals were no longer places one went to die, but to get better. Nursing became the honored profession that it is today, all thanks to that beautiful lady with the lamp. The